So one of my big projects for this year is to finally tackle an Edwardian corset. Now, we're not there yet, but we are getting closer. Since it still feels kind of like a scary project, I've decided to ease myself into it, with baby steps, as it were. I've made Regency stays, which are precursors to corsets, and this project is a modern but fantasy-inspired, easy corset pattern. This is Butterick B5935, which is one of those kind of a corset but also kind of stays patterns that you see in a lot of Ren Fair costumes. And when I had a look through the pattern pieces and instructions, it seemed pretty doable. And I had the perfect fabric waiting in my stash, so I made a quick mock-up, which fit remarkably well, and made a few adjustments, mostly to take it in actually, because as anyone who's sewn a Big 5 pattern knows, the sizing guide they give is not necessarily true to actual size. After the adjustments were made, I was happy with the fit and felt comfortable diving right into making the real thing. I did mark out the adjusted seam lines on my mock-up and used that to make a new pattern, since that would be easier than trying to fiddle with adjusting the paper. I wanted to make sure all my lines were accurate and precise, so I carefully marked sewing lines around the pattern edge. Since this is my pattern now, I didn't include seam allowance on the paper. Instead, I marked out 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around once it was pinned in place. And since we are making a fantasy corset, we must break out the shears of destiny. These are epic and look amazing, but they are not the most comfortable on the hands, so I did switch back to my fabric shears partway through cutting. Since some of the pieces look really similar, I made little post-it notes for all the pieces so that once the paper pattern was removed, I could still tell what everything was. Then I repeated the process with the lining fabric, giving my rotary cutter a try for this round. Again, I marked out precise lines and then added in the seam allowance. I mostly followed the instructions step by step for the sewing process, so the first thing is joining the side front pieces to the center front piece. There's also a bit of stay stitching that gets added to a couple of the front pieces, but I rather forgot to film that bit. Then I did the same thing with the front of the outer fabric. And then the side front pieces get added. I also took care of the modesty panel at this point too, since it just gets folded in half, sewn almost all the way around, flipped right side out, and then put into a corner until the rest of the corset is ready. Then it was time to work on the back of the corset. The two back halves get the center back pieces attached, as well as the side back pieces. And this is proof of why labeling is good, but also why paying attention is good. See this piece that was labeled as back middle side? Yeah, that's actually the front middle side, which kind of makes a little bit of a difference. Thankfully, I decided to pin everything together and then sew everything together all at once, so I caught the oopsie before I had to break out the seam ripper. Crisis averted, I went back to pinning all the back pieces together. And then we do the sew. So now the front is ready and both sets of back pieces are ready. They get pinned at the side seams and sewn together. The lining is also done in the exact same way, but beige canvas is so much less aesthetic to look at than brocade. Then all the seams of lining and outer fabric get pressed open, crisp and flat. It really does make a difference in how things sit if the seams are flat or not, so this is one crucial step one should not cut corners on. To help reduce a bit of bulk and make the boning channel sit easier, I trimmed down the seam allowance on the lining by about half. The pattern instructions say to use pre-cased boning, but I don't have any of that, and I wanted to only use materials from my stash if at all possible. Plus, I'm saving my budget from my Edwardian corset. So instead, I made boning channels out of twill tape I had previously gotten on clearance from Michaels. I quickly realized that with the curves in this corset, pinning wouldn't necessarily be a good option, so instead I decided to just hold the tape in place, adjusting as I went along. I stitched from the top edge of the corset to the bottom, and realized halfway along that my bobbin ran out. I replaced my thread, finished the length of sewing, and trimmed the tape to the seam allowance. Then I made a line across the seam allowance to hold the boning in place at the bottom, pivoted, and stitched up to the top. And I had to do a little sample test just to make sure it worked. It did! Yay! Then it was back to adding the rest of the channels. This is a lightly boned corset, so it just gets one bone at each seam and one at each center back edge to support the lacing. This is a fantasy corset, and I wasn't expecting or looking for any serious reduction, so I felt completely comfortable using industrial zip ties for boning. These were cut down to be just over half an inch shorter than the length of the boning channel. I also discovered that if you take the time to curve the edges as you're cutting instead of just snipping straight across, it makes for a nicer edge and cuts down the time you have to spend filing away sharp edges. I use an old nail file for this, and it works pretty decently, especially when you compare it with the ones where I just cut straight off. After the bones were in place, I added the modesty panel. This goes on the right side of the lining fabric and just stitch down along the inner edge. At last, the outer fabric and lining can get joined together. This happens a little differently from usual garment construction. The fabrics are joined wrong sides together, which is usually a no-no. There will be raw edges, but they're going to get covered with bias binding later, so this method works great. It's also perfect since you would be hard-pressed to flip these pieces right side out with the boning in the seams. And then we just sew all the way around. Now it's time to turn to the bias binding. I wanted this to match/contrast the corset, so I pulled out some gold taffeta from my stash. The pattern helpfully comes with a guide on how to cut to make enough bias tape for the corset, so here we go. Once the piece is cut out, I tried out my first of two new shiny tools, an expanding sewing gauge. This was very handy as it allowed me to easily mark out all the line markings at once. Then I connected my markings for easy cutting and joined up the ends of the piece. Bias tape making is not an intuitive task, but the end result is pretty cool. I picked a point to start cutting and then just cut all the way around and around and around. You start out with a wonky circle and end up with a pile of ribbon. This was my first time making bias tape, and since it would be such a large amount, I did decide to buy a bias tape kit. You basically feed one end of the fabric through the large end, and as it comes through, you iron it into shape. And then when the whole length is done, it gets folded in half again to make the classic bias tape shape. I have to say, having the kit is a total time saver and well worth the purchase. The next step is to bind the center back edges so the last two bones can go in. I may have deviated from the instructions here, but I stitched up along the right side and then pinned the other side of the boning into place with the bone in as well. This was because it was a bit of a tight fit, and I would rather do it this way than try to fiddle things into place. Then I hand stitched the binding and boning into place, taking care to only sew through the lining side and not let my thread show onto the outer fabric. Then came the long and finicky task of pinning binding to the rest of the corset, all the way along the top edge and bottom edge. And then it all gets carefully sewn down. The straps were the hardest part, but the straight and slight curved edges were pretty easy. Then all the raw binding edges get turned to the inside, pinned down, and stitched into place by hand. This, by far, took the longest out of any stage of making this corset. Could I have cut down the time by stitching it into place by machine like the pattern instructions said? Yes, I could have, but hand sewing is my jam, and I love me that extra touch. Then I broke out my sewing gauge again to measure for the lacing eyelets. Again, another tool that was well worth the investment. I had grand and glorious plans to put in some nice, shiny gold grommets for this corset. However, this was apparently not meant to be. I wrestled with my first grommet so much, and while I liked how it looked, I just knew it would not hold up to wear. That thing was going to pop right out the first time I tried to lace it up. So I decided to save myself the headache and hand sew eyelets instead. I pulled out some gorgeous red silk thread from my stash, and to be that little bit of #extra, I also added some gold embroidery thread. Then, as I've done many a time before, just poked the holes with an awl and did a basic whip stitch all the way around. You know, many a seamstress will say they poured their blood, sweat, and tears into a project, and they often mean literally. Thankfully, this is one project where it blends in. The two sides of the straps also get eyelets sewn in. I had heard mixed opinions on how much lacing you need for a corset, so I did a sample lace up with my ribbon to figure it out. Again, clearance ribbon from my stash. I also cut two 18-inch pieces of narrower ribbon for the strap lacing, since I felt that the wider ribbon would just be too much. I did a quick try on of the corset, went squee because I made a corset, and it fit. And then figured out how much ribbon I would need to cut off because I did not need the entirety of the 7-yard spool. I ended up cutting off 2 yards and laced it up for real. I also used the bunny ear style of lacing, which is the style on all the modern corsets I own, so is the style of lacing I'm most familiar with. A quick knot at the ends, and this corset is ready for fantasy adventures. Now, if only I could find a castle. I love this corset. I am so proud that I made a corset and that it looks so pretty. Like all my projects, I can always see room for improvement, but where would we be as creators if we never grew and progressed our skills? This is going to be perfect for frolicking fantasy fun, and it did a wonderful job of baby-stepping me toward a proper historical corset. There were a lot of steps along the way where I treated this fabric with the same level of care and detail as if I were actually working on a historical corset. And I have to say that was one of the best things I could have done. It built muscle memory, taking a style of sewing I had never tried before and making the actions tangible. I could look at the pieces and go, oh, this looks like a piece on my Edwardian pattern. This is how I would sew some of the more complicated pieces together. This is how I would lace it up. And building that muscle memory in turn built confidence. I am still a little nervous about undertaking a real historical build, but far less so now. I can actually look at my plans and go, yeah, I'm gonna do this, and it's gonna turn out awesome. So if you enjoyed this corset making endeavor and want to see how I tackle making a pretty house-made Edwardian corset, please hit the subscribe button and stick around. I have many more geekery meets history sewing adventures on the way.